It's very interesting that Congress used to be almost entirely secret, and then they opened their doors in the 70s. So they're going to be interviewing me, and
Yeah.
I'm going to try and remain as slippery as possible because I can't really say the guys are destroying me
Yeah.
over there by simply writing weaponized amendments.
Yeah.
Before they opened the
Yeah.
votes,
Gotcha.
there were no weaponized amendments.
The competition in Congress and it certainly takes away from the spirit of cooperation and trying to find compromise and trying to create, better legislation that would serve various ends.
And then, boom, we became the United States of today, which is...
Welcome to Paying Attention with me, Nicholas Gruen, and my trusty cup of green tea, and Peyton Bowman, my friend. And we have a special guest, James D'Angelo, and he is from the Congressional Research Institute in Boston. Now, I need to explain to you how I met James, and it's a thoroughly 21st century meeting, which is over Twitter. And on can I get a date here? Yes, I can. The 1st of June. So it's now the 22nd. We move fast around here. On the 1st of June, James D'Angelo tweeted this with a link to me. You, Nicholas, might be the first person besides our team who has mentioned the power of secrecy with respect to climate. And, well, that certainly was enough to interest me. And I didn't know I was a great advocate of secrecy. But all will be revealed. So right now, I think I'll invite James to reveal what he was getting at in that tweet, and then we'll develop the conversation from there.
Climate's the biggest issue for me. There's a number of issues that I look into in the United States, where I do most of my research, though not exclusively. I spend a lot of time in Latin America, Uganda, Europe, East Africa in general. I came across just the strangest thing looking at data is that certain types of legislation, if not all, that I cared about seemed to pass when there was elements of secrecy involved in it. Legislation that I enjoyed. With respect,
did you just sort of happen upon that finding, or did you sort of have did you start getting an idea that this was an important thing and then hunted down
the genesis
sort of corroborating
of this
evidence?
is rather humbling. I had a friend who was very into The West Wing, if you're not familiar with that, very famous American TV show, mostly about the executive branch, but you see the executive branch, the president dealing with Congress, and occasionally they talk about votes.
Yeah.
And one of my very good friends is just this polymath, right? Just one of these guys you want to take to every trivia concert, has decided that he's going to write screenplays, and he's now working in LA as a screenwriter. So he's done very well with this. But his first idea, because he loved The West Wing, was to write something similar to The West Wing, but perhaps related to Congress. And he was grabbing archival tapes and videos and everything he could to sort of get him up to speed. And he was playing in my brother's house a videotape of Congress voting. And I'd never seen it before. So, the year is somewhere around the year 2000. The internet's pretty beefy at this point, but I just hadn't seen it. And Congress is voting, and their names are popping up on the screen, and the green lights are going on, and the red lights are going on, and they're saying yay, nay. And I said to him, I was like, and it was just a gut reaction. I think my hair even raised on my arm. I said to him, they vote publicly? And he's like, yeah, of course. I'm like, I immediately thought about their family and friends, terrorizing them for every single vote. Little did I realize that there's so much more than your family and friends who may or may not terrorize you for votes. So I went right to this sense of fear that I had for them, standing there and making the vote. And of course, they've got a lot of friends in Congress. They've been talking to people about bills and all of that. So every vote is loaded with the emotions that they might have. So I told my friend, and he rips me a new a-hole, as we say, Because transparency is just the most incredible thing, and this is the way it's done, and this is the way it's always happened, and I just didn't know enough about government to say anything, and he's always just been so solidly correct on these things. And that
Well, I mean, I would say, I would jump in and say that it doesn't seem to me to be viable to say that you've got a democracy if the people if you don't have some idea, if you don't have some way of knowing whether
right,
you've
and that's
elected a
probably
mole.
one of the things he said. Unfortunately, I don't remember what he said, but for somehow, I just it didn't sit with me as a
Yep.
great answer. And Steve's always provided me with a great answer. It just
Yep.
felt a little
Yep.
bit weird, and that was around.
So nobody had at this stage. Nobody had come up with this idea that maybe we've got not really that everything should be secret, but that we've got too much transparency. I'm taking that to be
It's not.
your
I mean,
position.
at that point, it certainly wasn't. I really, I don't know if you know my history. I got a master's in electrical engineering. I did some work for NASA. I've loved data. I got involved with cryptocurrencies, but mostly on the level of like verifying code and things like that. So I taught people about the code of it. Of course, almost everything I did, and I worked in Gabon on a national park. I was very concerned with the climate crisis. I was reading everything I could, but I never really thought to read about Congress. But through a weird set of twists and turns, I was reading a book by Fareed Zakaria, and rather impressive book. I mean, it's called The Future of Freedom, and I still read this book and just thoroughly enjoy it. And here's a guy who grew up in India, but he grew up as a minority in India. So he's a Muslim, and the Hindi are rather violently controlling the country, certainly on his watch. He's seeing life in India change. And so he's very concerned about the ability of majorities and even minorities to capture government. But he's just the most thoughtful character. So he's writing, he studied, I believe, at Princeton and Harvard, and he's made quite a name for himself. But so I'm reading this book, and it's all kind of eye-popping. And then I would say the book really should be titled, "We Need to Rethink Democracy," right? And he goes into Aristotle, talking about democracies easily captured by demagogues and the populism and all of that. And he doesn't really walk the line of, where the framers went. The framers formed a republic. But he gets to, I believe it's like chapter 6, somewhere around page 175. He says, well, it's very interesting that Congress used to be almost entirely secret, and then they opened their doors in the 70s. And I was like, what? How could I not know that? That's impossible. How could I not know? And I got that same chill. So the hair raised on my arm again. I'm like, oh my God, this is so weird. My friend didn't mention this, right? It changed in my lifetime. And so that was around 2006. And I was just kind of, I sat with it again. I talked with people about it. People thought it was kind of curious, but I kind of left it alone. And then it was around 2014 where I was like, okay, I'm going to read everything I can about government.
So hang on, I think I better just clarify. So hang on, I think I better just clarify. So we're not talking votes on bills. The final bill has always been public,
Right.
in your lifetime anyway. But you are talking about
Correct.
votes in committee stage. And you're also
Correct.
talking about deliberation in committee stage, aren't you? You just close the doors and say, this is our business. and we'll let you know what the bill looks like after we've taken it through committee, and we'll
That's an
all get to
excellent
publicly vote.
clarification, and I would say that's a fairly good rule of thumb. So most votes were open when they were the final votes, the final legislation, and most votes were secret. Though I'm finding pretty good evidence now that a lot of the passage of the final votes were secret back then too, and people just didn't talk about it. So Stephen Smith, one of the best scholars here, writes that outright. He's like, it's just incredible how much stuff passed without a final vote being public.
Okay. So it passed, and each of the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate voted, and
Correct.
we don't have a record of how they voted on the final
Correct.
on the final bill. So the congressional
Correct.
record says,
Correct.
and the bill was
legislation
passed.
was passed, and I don't have good examples of
Wow.
that. That's a fairly
Does it give a number?
say that again.
Does it provide numbers?
Exactly. I don't have any examples of that. So that's something I read recently, and I sent to my colleagues.
No, but does it say in the Senate? Does it say in the Senate the bill passed 62 to 38? I've probably got the numbers.
Unfortunately, I don't have a good example.
No, 38.
For one big reason is most of the time they don't list on bills whether it was voted on secretly or not at any point. So that's true in almost every legislature around the world. So I can't just type in this bill was voted on secretly and find all the bills in the world that were voted on secretly.
No, but if it's voted on publicly, I mean, judging by Hansard, our version of the congressional record, I would have thought that it contains a list. It
Correct.
contains a record of how people voted.
Correct. And
I said,
this is a recent thing that I read by Stephen Smith. So we're talking a couple of weeks ago. I sent it to my friends, and I haven't gone back and done the homework on which specific ones. But if you've seen the Lincoln movie, which is about the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, it's really quite a beautiful movie.
Yeah, I've seen it.
And it's all about a single vote and a public vote.
Yeah.
And it talks about almost all the things that we might expect with a public vote, which is the potential bribery, intimidation, and fears of the legislators. Not just from, there's massive harassment inside the chamber itself. I suspect that's exactly correct. Some of the other things, they took some historical fiction approaches to some of the others, so we don't have good evidence for. But they talk about the intimidation that Lincoln used. Back then, it was a lot of patronage that you would apply to people, removals of patronage that you would apply, and the entire movie is basically about how to get those votes through arm twisting, bribery, whatever. It leaves aside the fact that the other side probably did the exact same thing, right? So whatever votes are open, there's pressure. But in 2015, I was walking around the reservoir. I was sort of ADD approach to catching up on all of American congressional history, etc. And so I had Elizabeth Warren's book, so many other people's books going through my head, and it wasn't left or right. I was just listening to whatever I could. But I kept hearing, within the first chapter, I kept hearing the same thing. Everything seemed to be going well. And then in the early 70s, it went haywire. Listen to a book on incarceration. Incarceration rates in the United States were dropping for 50 years to a point where they were discussing in D.C. the possibility of eliminating prisons. Discussing the possibility of eliminating prisons. They just weren't seeing the benefit. And then, boom, we became the United States of today, which is we incarcerate far more than any other country. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's breathtaking.
About 10.
What's that?
Well, over 10 times. Yeah, it's over. I think it's about 20 times what it is in Australia.
And we have enough cases of people who are in there for the wrong reasons, etc. But it shoots up like a rocket ship. And this pattern, this graph, you can basically take the incarceration numbers and plop it onto partisanship. And it's the same thing. You can plop it onto inequality. It's the same graph. And there's some slippage as to the point of when it turns, but that slippage is minor. We're talking a few years. And we see this with the filibuster. We see this with closed rules, all these very technical things. We see it with the number of amendments offered, okay, which is quite outrageous.
So the number of amendments offered goes up.
And this is actually one of the most important but most wonky aspects of this. And I'll explain it very quickly, which is I've just arrived in office and I've won by 2%, but I've beat, say, Peyton. And Peyton and his gang are a bit bitter, right? They want Peyton back in 2 years. So Peyton's friends who are still in Congress, they start writing legislation that hurts me.
Well, but so they're trying to wedge you. They're trying to wedge
they're
you.
Expressly
they're
going, well, James in his district, his constituents, so 52% of the people voted for him, which is ungodly right now to have that many votes, but 52% voted for me. In my district, there's going to be something that divides those 52%, okay, that I didn't have to run on. I came in office, I didn't have to run on this. Peyton's friends go, oh, well, they've got an issue with, they're putting up some new gambling center, or there's a highway going in, or something like that. Something that half of the people in my constituency hate and the other half love. And so Peyton's friends write what are called weaponized amendments or messaging amendments, right? And now I have to vote on every single one of them. Okay, and if you're in the Senate, you don't even have to make it germane. So there could be a bill on mother's milk formula, and Peyton's friends could write something on the highway. Okay, and he can add it. And if it's amendment, and the amendments are public, I have to vote on it. What do they do after I vote on it? They write another one on the same thing.
Yeah.
Then they write another one on the same thing. They keep writing the same amendment in. All right, so the most famous example of this is this guy named
the idea of this is to say that this person voted against this on 25 occasions.
No one on earth looks more corrupt than I do. Okay, they've managed.
Well, hang on. I can understand. Hang on. I can understand why they've successfly divided your supporters.
I'm going to be in trouble. I know that. So I'm going to
just
hem and haw on these things. I'm going to be interviewed on it, and I'm going to be like, God, in my mind going, this has nothing to do with national policy. This has nothing to do with the climate issue that I ran on. This has nothing to do with this. So they're going to be interviewing me, and I'm going to try and remain as slippery as possible, because I can't really say the guys are destroying me over there by simply writing weaponized amendments. Before they opened the vote, there were no weaponized amendments. Stephen Smith is the first to basically wrote a book on this, saying this could be all the amendments right now. We don't know. It's hard to define, right? Is this good legislation? But we certainly have characters like Jesse Helms, who comes in and adds a rider to everything based on Mapplethorpe's art exhibit where there was a penis hanging out, or all these hot button issues, right? Abortion, obviously, being a big one. You can attach an abortion rider to anything. And he became, so his goal, Helms, I would think it was his goal, was to destroy the Democrats, right? So now the Democrats have to vote on all these hot button issues and basically look like they're trying to sell porn. The trouble is there's friendly fire involved with these things, because all his moderate Republicans now have to push hard right. So what it does, this weaponizing, drives partisanship more than anything else out there. So all these guys are going, we want to be moderates, but they have no choice, because all these amendments will be weaponized. And when we're talking the number of amendments increased, in 1970, the number of amendments were around 100. They went up to 1,800 by 1978. Okay, and so they started to pass. So when people get mad at McConnell or some congressional leader, when they get mad at them for closing the process down, saying no amendments, I sympathize with McConnell. Because if you open that up, that legislation will be torn apart by everybody sending guns back and forth. So that happened. So basically what happened to me is I've got my headphones in, I'm marching around the pond there, I've got a little boy back home, and actually he was in his daycare, and I keep hearing something happened in the 70s. And so I'm like, whoa, I've now read in Zachariah's book that this thing changed in the 70s. And then everything that we're looking at, the rise of lobbying, right? The rise of campaign finance. This is all the same graph. I mean, and even the angle it's shockingly similar.
So, so the odd thing is that, I mean, you were talking about looking at this in other countries. Certainly in Australia, I'm pretty sure that committee, we don't have those kinds of weaponized amendments. I don't think I'm pretty sure we have open. Everything is open. There's no secrecy in committees, and you just don't see this happening to anything like that extent. It may be that America, I think, has always had these strange, very idiosyncratic traditions of being able to tack funny amendments onto all kinds of strange
Correct.
bills. I don't think that exists. We do have some traditions a bit like that. A thing called the adjournment, where people can get up and make speeches about anything. But that's making a speech is they're going to make a speech if they want to make a speech. So it's very different.
Well, one thing I think is kind of striking about these amendments too is that it essentially makes the voting process more competitive overall between these different parties in some ways, right? So it's like you've taken this new guy in the Congress and suddenly he's being ganged up on by a bunch of other people, and it just sort of increases this the competition in Congress, and it certainly takes away from the spirit of cooperation and trying to find compromise and trying to create better legislation that would serve various ends.
Correct. And the thing is, every legislator knows about this. When we first started looking at it, there was not much more to look at than what Stephen Smith had written. Then Frances Lee from Princeton basically publishes a book about this. She calls them messaging. But as you learn how to find them, the different words that people use, they call them buncombe amendments, they call them bomb throwing, depending on the generation, right? Because no one's really systematically investigated them, probably until Frances Lee started to look at them. And even she would probably argue that it needs to be done better. We've now collected citations on it. And at first it was like hard to get 10. Now we've got hundreds, right? And I see examples of this almost every day where people are literally writing amendments to screw the other side. And getting back to you, Nicholas, you're absolutely correct. Institutional rules matter. So we are a very old democracy with a very old system, right? We aren't parliamentary, which is a different approach to how you would attack a legislator or a group of legislators. In many ways, this individual voting that happens in the committees and the primaries that we have leave members very much alone. And so they can be attacked individually. And that's very important. Anthony King, who is a British scholar, wrote a book called Running Scared. And I just love Anthony King. Unfortunately passed away recently. And this book is fantastic. He basically says that. He goes, we're unique in our ability to leave a legislator hanging and fighting for themselves.
It's certainly very striking as an outsider seeing how in American politics you constantly hear one of the most frequently used attacks is these people voted for this bill on 12 occasions and stuff like that. And that doesn't happen very much in Australia. It's party by party contact or competition. It's not really member by member competition. Very, very interesting. I mean, Peyton mentions competition. It's really two things, I think. Competition, the idea of competition and the idea of accountability. And the issue is, and I think what your work, James, is pointing out, is accountability to whom. And so one of the things that Peyton and I have spoken about in the past is the way in which we've set our democracy up to be a democracy which flatters the voters. So the voters love to think that they're in charge. And so it's easy to sell them the idea that we'll open up the committee hearings because you deserve to know. And you do deserve to know, but the problem is that if you let you know, then the people who will who these congressional men and women, congressmen and women, are ultimately made accountable to are people like the NRA who've got the resources to keep an eye on them the whole time and then terrorize them with the threat of misinformation, which, as I've seen reading your stuff, James, some Republican woman, you can probably provide the name, I can't, who made some suggestions on gun control that were the absolute soul of modesty and reasonableness, and they run this campaign about her being un-American and not believing in the Second Amendment.
And she, I believe her name was Deborah Maggart. Keep in mind with these, they all play the same game. So if you're talking the Israel lobby, if you're talking the oil industry, if you're talking pharma, they all play the same game. We think they've got unlimited money. They don't. Okay. But so they, and this whole notion that you bribe someone is such tomfoolery, because bribery, first of all, isn't in humans' DNA, right? So chimpanzees don't bribe. They intimidate, right? If they want something, they go and beat you, right? And the first reaction that humans have had throughout history is to attack the offender, not to offer them a sweetener. Okay. So intimidation is cheap. It is so cheap. So almost the more powerful you are, the cheaper it is. So if the big bully's walking down the street, he doesn't need to throw many punches to get what he wants. He just turns his head and you tremble in fear. Whereas the weaker group, the poorer group, the one with less resources, they might go, oh, those guys are really bad, and the legislator isn't going to care. So intimidation actually biases very strongly in favor of the powerful. But it also has, it shoots like a shotgun, a sawed-off shotgun, right? So if you are an offending, Nicholas, you voted against us for some reason, right? You already know before you made that vote that we're going to come, because that's our history. And we're going to come, maybe there's many ways that we'll do it, but we're going to attack you in the cheapest way possible. The most important way is to attack you in the primary, where voters don't really turn out, advertising time is a lot cheaper, and I can attack you on your side. So if your district's always Republican, I'm going to throw a Republican challenger against you. So we're going to fund the challenger. And there's so much history of this. So the Chamber of Commerce has basically announced if their rating goes down below 46%, all of our money will switch from them to their challenger. Who's their challenger?
So hang on. I didn't understand that. So you got the Chamber of Commerce.
Right. So
now, what's the rule that they apply?
Is this person voting consistent with how we want them to vote? So remember, every single vote is counted. All your committee votes.
Yeah. And then they give them a rating, and if it falls below a certain figure.
Israel rates, whether they publish it or not. The NRA rates, often they do publish. The Democratic Committee rates. Everybody rates. Okay. And if you fall below a certain point, then the money goes to your challenger. And I think it's very important to see to your challenger, unnamed. So anybody at all, right? So that's not bribery. We're handing money over to anybody at all.
But even so, you're still saying. But it's not. But even so, you're still saying. I think you're still saying that the much stronger threat is not really to move your funding, but to then have a negative campaign against a particular person. I'm just showing
you the very cheap things that will happen, right? So with Deborah Maggart, the NRA put 70 grand in because she was a state legislator in Tennessee. So she was not showing up into D.C.
Not much.
Into D.C. 70,000 in a state race, especially in Tennessee, is like coming in like you're the richest person on earth.
Yeah.
So they ran some ads, they did some radio time, and they just went after her. 70,000 through that election. And this is a woman who had an A+ rating with the NRA. and she was proposing, let me tell you how wonderful this legislation was. Someone had pulled a loaded gun out of a car and shot someone. And she said, well, it should be, you've got to lock your car.
You got to lock
your gun in your car. Okay, that was the legislation.
Now, and then it was the NRA who went after her and spent $70,000
correct.
on negative
I
campaigning against her.
I haven't looked at that one for almost 8 years, so I'm not sure if it's the NRA. I'm pretty sure it was the NRA at that point. The NRA was flexing a lot of muscles then. It was a pro-gun group. And they're not always alone. And keep in mind, it's not just the special interests. You've got a lot of loonies everywhere. So these people that storm the Capitol aren't Americans. They're not indicative of Americans.
States.
These are the absolute most lunatic Americans, which is 0.01%.
Yeah, but you're well stocked.
Right. Well,
Americans well stocked with lunatics.
We pride ourselves in being a little special there, but we're a fabulously big country with a lot of money. So the median net worth is $60,000. So these people can fly and spend their time doing nothing but being annoying to legislators, and they're very angry. And so they show up, right? And even though they're 0.01%, even with Deborah Maggart, I'm sure she saw some of these loonies, right? Who, the NRA is now like, go after her. And not all negative attack ads are misinformation. Some of them are doing the very thing we were talking about. In my district, I have troubles with the highway or the gambling or something. And even though the gun group wants me out, they may run an ad about the highway. Right? So we know that 95% of dark money is negative ads. It's attack ads. We don't always know the philosophy behind every single one of them. But again, it's not, let's drill the philosophy. The NRA doesn't want to run more ads about how great guns are, especially after Sandy Hook. They just want to run something negative. So if Obama's ratings are down and that Republican member's in a photo with Obama, that will be the ad. And so it's not, they aren't playing on an even playing field. They're just going to take you out. And this is all based on committee votes. Almost all their things are going to be on committee votes because final legislation in many cases is jumbled. It's bundled. So legislators do that intentionally, right? So we want to pass something that is going to fix this baby formula problem. But we've got a lot of resistance from some special interests somewhere. Well, we just attach it to something to do with military reauthorization. Or, right, this is what they do to deal with annoying special interest groups, right? And it works. I mean, historically, we know this works, right? So if we've got troubles with guns and the whole public's just being ridiculous about guns, well, we just attach it in, right? Nowadays, you can't attach anything in, right? You can't sneak stuff in because you've got that violent, rabid public watching every particular committee vote. And so that's what we get. And I would say, just as a great example, where the public can always be a problem is with respect to crime, right? So you don't poll a single district in the United States where the people in that district have a realistic interpretation for the amount of crime in their district. And they're always wrong in one direction. They always think crime is worse. Partly because of how newspapers and the media represents crime, partly because of our innate fears of crime. And so the public is always hungry for stronger crime legislation. And every legislator knows this. And they've even spoken about it. They're like, look, if we can do this in secret, we would not be passing these egregious laws. And you see exactly that. So as soon as they open the committees, every legislator, whether you're on the right or the left, you have no choice but to be tough on crime. So even though we know we're putting way too many people in jail and prison, you continue to write tougher crime bills. And you have no choice.
One thing I think is kind of striking, though, about this is if I were in Congress, I would hate this. I would want to go back to this but I suppose one aspect of this kind of intimidation that you're talking about is that the people who end up going to Congress kind of collaborate well with these special interest groups to begin with? Or, I mean, all the people who would have stood up to him get kind of intimidated and uh, thrown out by the competition they put up. Is that right?
So, yeah, I think that's an excellent point. There are some people who will enter Congress and they want to make noise, and we all know examples of that. And that noise actually helps them in their districts, so their ratings go up, right? So they all want to make some noise, right?
Yeah.
You can't be super quiet because the public.
Yeah,
The
well,
public,
it's a system of
the
noise
public
making.
pushed Robert E. Lee to leave the South and go fight in the North, which was just the most idiotic policy. They want you to move. They want you to be on the move, to be on the attack, and so you don't have much choice. But again, I would argue that if we assumed legislators were all ideal, so my job was to go to Congress and my big thing was to work on climate, then maybe after that race, then maybe after that something to do with the economy, right? If that was my job, because of how the system is, I would have no choice but to vote corruptly. I would just let me finish. I would have no choice but to vote corruptly on guns and anything else I didn't care about because I would be put over a barrel on all the other topics.
Yeah, well, that's right. But I think Peyton's question is, so why don't they get together and vote themselves a bit more privacy in
because
committee?
it's the whack-a-mole, right? Which member of Congress is going to step up and say, "Oh my God, the public's killing us," or we need to hide our votes, right? All the press is basically Congress is corrupt; they're taking bribery, right? And we see this, and these are billionaire-owned media companies who profit very well from all the negative ads, where the money doesn't go to the member of Congress; it goes to the billionaire-owned media companies, right? So there's a lot of profit there. A lot of the rich owners of these media companies have strong ties to these libertarian roots in our country, and they're spreading that very strongly elsewhere. So this anti-government that we saw with Goldwater in '64, followed up with Reagan, who said government is the problem. This is the message that's being poured on. So these guys are very scared of saying anything that would appear corrupt, right? And that's why it was really remarkable in 2019 when Francis Lee from Princeton presented the problems with transparency to a committee, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. The only responses were like, "Oh, yes. Oh, please, we need to shut the door down." Yes,
And
they
did they
publicly spoke about it,
and did they
but they
publicly
speak with
report to
somewhat
that effect?
coded words. They can't say we need to work in secret, right? But one of them, it was just so beautiful. I believe his name's Preston from Washington, and he's asking the pro-transparency guy because they have Francis Lee, who I thought would be pro-transparency until I got a million tweets. She's pushing your agenda, right? And then 3 other pro-transparency guys who've been there forever who don't know a single thing about Congress, apparently, because the legislators basically asking in coded, very soft words about this weaponization of amendments. And he goes, "How do you propose to solve that?" To the pro-transparency guy who goes, "Well, maybe we could have some rooms where they can hang out and eat cake before they vote." And I'm like, you literally don't even understand message voting, right? And you could see the member just going, "God, this is such a problem. We see it with ourselves. We see it with the other party. This is driving everybody crazy." And he speaks, and you can see him. He's pleading. And he gets this ridiculous answer. And he says to the guy, he looks shocked. He's like, "You think that would solve this?" And the guy has no idea what he's talking about because, he's a liberal arts grad, never really studied Congress. And he's pushing the pro-transparency agenda, which is basically the pro-transparency agenda. If you want to make money selling a reform idea, you put transparency in your line, and you're going to get money from the Koch brothers. You're going to get support from Google, Microsoft. Bezos is pushing. They're all the people we're supposed to be checking have money behind transparency. They do not have money on the other side. Okay, so it's a one-sided fundraising affair. And it's big. It's not a small amount of funding. We're talking millions and millions and millions of dollars.
So there are secret ballots. For instance, the ballot the ballot in the House of Commons. No, no, it wasn't in the House of Commons. It was in the Conservative Party for the no confidence motion
Correct,
in the Prime
correct,
Minister Boris
correct.
Johnson. That was a secret ballot. Are there any? And I would imagine that party leadership ballots and things like that in the
They
American
can
system are
be.
also
They can
secret
be. So
ballots. Is that right
every
or not?
vote still. So Chuck
Yeah.
Schumer during the impeachment. So Chuck Schumer's the head of the Senate. During the impeachment trial for the Senate, Chuck Schumer says on video, he's like, "Well, there's just a no-brainer. If we had a secret ballot vote, Trump's gone, right?" And almost all the data we saw. But then he says, and he
So
makes a mistake. He says, "But we can't do that," and he's wrong. And maybe he's reading the Washington Post, which wrote an article a week before saying you can't have a secret ballot, which was wrong.
well,
And I wrote the author, and the author apologized for being wrong, but never published an article about it.
yeah, okay. So that seems to be,
But that could have
that
been
seems to
secret
be
ballot. It's in our
a
Constitution. Article 1,
one.
Section 5 allows the Congress.
Yeah. So there are so now there are potential ways in which you could
Correct,
address
correct.
some of these things.
So we're not asking for.
The other thing is that I've got this. The proposal that I have is a different proposal, but it involves a secret ballot. And it involves a secret ballot in a very specific
Correct.
circumstance. So where I'm coming from on this is that if I look at certainly the English-speaking world where I am more familiar, in Australia was the leader, and the United Kingdom was the next cab off the rank, and the United States that one afterwards, which is that some of the most important, the most critical things that their legislature chooses to do are against the consciences of the legislators themselves. So in 2013, the Australian Parliament voted against Australia's then world-leading carbon pricing mechanism, which the government, having just won an election on the grounds that it was a carbon tax, which it wasn't really, but even if it was, it certainly shouldn't have been repealed. And it was good politics to say that this is a terrible new tax and we're going to repeal it. But most of the people who voted to repeal, firstly, one side of politics voted to keep it. So it was a fairly close run thing. But more than half of the right of centre party that voted to get rid of it, more than half the members knew that that was a terrible
Yeah.
decision, that that was a terrible thing to do. In Britain, you have Brexit, where it was just bleedingly obvious that the last thing the Commons wanted to do was vote for Brexit, and members of Parliament in the United Kingdom take Edmund Burke and conservatism far more seriously than they do in our country. And one of the things Edmund Burke said was that your member of Parliament owes you their judgment more than they owe you their vote. And so they made a big fuss, but eventually they were bullied into passing Brexit, which then goes on as the sort of rolling train wreck that it is. And then in the United States, you have things like the impeachment of Donald Trump. Now, what I suggested was I'm also arguing for a House of, or something like a House of Parliament, just an additional one, with very little power, but it would be randomly selected citizens. And then if that chamber disagreed with the vote of another chamber, it could impose another vote, and that vote would be a secret ballot. So you could have certain votes in, and this I would have thought is the sort of thing you can argue. I mean, it's not more pro-transparency than what you have, but it's
It is
more
more
accountability than
pro-transparent.
what you have, which
It
is
is
that
more.
you have. Hold on a second. That on certain votes which you might want to define,
Yes.
you have a
Yes.
public vote and then you have a
That
private
is,
vote.
I mean, obviously, as just a pure scholar who likes Karl Popper, who says, try things, wait till you see it fail. Adrian Vermeule wrote a paper about
Yeah.
this, I
Yeah.
believe in 2014, called Open Secret Voting, where he even proposes the idea how great it would be to have both an open and a secret vote on all issues. Why not? I
Yeah. Well, that's an
I would
interesting.
argue, so
I
you
think
get
that's an
more
interesting
information, of
idea.
course, because the public now gets more information. You get your individual members vote, and then you get this strange reversal, which happens whenever it's
Yeah.
secret.
Yeah.
And all history that we have says you get fantastic, insane reversals. So we saw it with the Liz Cheney vote recently, where one was secret, one was voice, where the secret one, 2/3 of the
Yeah.
Republicans embraced her. And then as soon as they could turn around and see who was yelling yay or nay, they all shut up. We see this in Italy. So the Italian constitution is the only constitution that basically says what you're talking about, where after a public vote, any member can raise their hand and ask for a secret vote. And so one of the scholars there, I think her name is Giametti, has analyzed like 40 of these famous reversals. And when I talk reversals, we're talking, again, sort of like Cheney, where
I'd love you to send that. I'd love you to send that to
and
me.
you
I'd
see
be
these
most
massive
interested.
reversals, 60% one way, then 60% the other, in a span of 5 minutes.
Yeah. Right.
And yeah, so I would love, that's just extra data. And I argue that the difference between those votes is a way to measure intimidation.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, what else?
It's the only way to measure intimidation.
What else is it?
Intimidation is the most loosey-goosey thing to measure. But this would be the first data point where I could reliably say, I believe we're now measuring intimidation. So
in the Italian system where somebody makes that election,
I love that
what is
you
the
asked that.
dispositive
So the
vote?
Italian constitution
What
is a
vote?
problem,
Yeah.
right? You have a yes vote and you have a no vote. The Italian constitution says we will take the secret vote because that is the truer vote.
That's the experience of Venice. That's the experience of Venice, I suspect, and the Catholic Church and all that stuff. Because that Venice, I don't know how much you've read
a
up on
chunk of
Venice,
that book and
from what
found
I
some of
sent
it
you.
so fascinating. Yes.
Yeah.
The Italian Constitution is
exactly.
written in 1947, so it's a fairly modern one, but it is the only one where you can end up with a lot of those. Now, keep in mind, raising your hand to call for the secret vote is public, and so there's pressure there. So the person who called for the secret vote on Liz Cheney knew. There's just no way they didn't know that was going to be a slap in the face to Trump. I can't find out who called it or the group of people who called it. But it would be known. No, because that's a caucus. A caucus doesn't have to publish everything, right? They can do everything in secret. But you have to keep the secret.
Well, yes, but you have to keep the secret. If it's open voting in the caucus, someone can betray you.
Ballot vote. It's so absurd in this day and age for a caucus to have a secret ballot vote on a polemical issue like that. But it was the person who called it. It wasn't Liz Cheney. She wasn't allowed to do that, right? Someone else was like, watch what this does. Let's throw this bomb, right? And it didn't hit like the bomb that they assumed, but it certainly gave someone like me, the Republicans hate Trump, obviously. Well, there it is, and they're terrified.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, well, we know that.
And you name the issue when we can find the fear. And it's really there. So it allows for special interest capture. But I love your idea. I mean, wouldn't that be great if a non congressional group could raise their hand and go, "Oh yeah, that was wonderful. All right, just toss that. Let's just get a secret vote on that as well."
Well, there you go. That's well, there you go. That's your assignment for the future, James. Just make it happen in the make it happen in the greatest democracy we know of.
The part that won't happen in my lifetime is that Italian resolution of the two votes, though. The American public is not ready for a secret vote being the de facto winner on something like that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's certainly now that
It
is
is.
a
It's more
pro-transparency measure
information.
because you get
That's all
more
it is. So
information.
that's why when you were saying, "Well, it's not as,"
Yeah,
I'm like, "No,
that's
that's
good.
more. We get more." So
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think we've given you your assignment for the
I
next 6 months. We'll invite you back to tell us how you've been going. We're going to set up, and Peyton and my next podcast, we'll talk about what KPIs we're going to set you and how we're going to measure your performance over the next 6 months. And I think
my
six
son who
months time, you should
questions
be
me
you
how
should
where
be
I'm
fine.
going with this, I'm like, I'm hoping to hand my notes to your son because we know it skips generations, right? And you'll be the one who finally carries this on.
Yeah, that sort of things can happen. Well, now the other thing is that we should, I'm thinking this is a good place to end, but we probably should take a secret vote.
They don't offer that inside of your system, do they? Yeah.
They
We
don't,
push
do
for
they?
that before we
They
go for
don't.
Congress.
But yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, no, that's very good. I'm very pleased to have learned about that Italian thing, and I like the fact, whether it's true or not, I like my speculation that it ties in with the Venetian, the familiarity with secret ballots that is true, that has occurred in Italy since the Renaissance. Where they had a lot of sortition, but they did elections as well, often
Yeah.
by people selected at random, and then they always had secret
The one
ballots
thing,
because they were
I
trying
haven't
to
read
get
the
rid
full
of
book, but I
corruption.
do want to ask
So,
you that I find fascinating. But I find
well, I'm no
fascinating is
expert,
that
but
they had
anyway, go
no
on.
president, they had no king, they were a council with no. Oh,
Well, they
okay,
did. They had
okay.
an
Oh,
elective
all
king.
right. So I
They had an
didn't.
elective
So
king
I
called
was
the
just
Doge.
reading snippets as I was doing searches, right? And I was like, "What is there no?"
Yeah, no. This is the Doge.
Okay,
The Doge of Venice is a little bit like the Pope. It's chosen a
okay,
bit in a way that the Pope is chosen in that it's a conclave the Roman Catholic Church call it a conclave. It's a group of electors who
and they had executive
deliberate
power.
and come up with someone. But well, in theory, but they're the mildest
Okay,
of constitutional monarchs. So throughout this whole period, a doge. Well, basically, when they get to be the doge, they're usually about 70, and they're there for about 10 years until they drop off the perch. They're usually
right.
quite old and very revered old guys. And they're given, at the beginning of this period, which was 1297, they were given a 100-page document to sign, which was their contract for being the doge. It wasn't called a contract. That grew to 300 pages, and they had they had a council of 10, a bit like a cabinet, and they had about 3 or 4 sort of people like the Secretary of State and so on, and
Okay.
they couldn't disagree with those guys. So they're not exactly like Queen Elizabeth II, who's a bit more like a kind of
Right,
Monty
right.
Python
So they're
show
not
than a
that
real
weak,
monarch.
but they
But,
aren't as
but
strong as a president in the U.S. Yeah, and I found that very fascinating.
nothing like it. And their authority, is a sort of an authority of their presence
Because
in
we
their
respect old
age
people in
as
the United
elders.
States, of course.
They're a
We
big.
love our old leaders.
Well, you're just getting more and more respect for them.
Respect is just the word I would use. That sort of.
Exactly. I wouldn't. Look, if I were you, James, I wouldn't vote for any president that was under 75, and I don't think there's any risk of you
No
needing to
risk,
worry
none
about
at
that
all.
for another
Well,
few years.
unless COVID 2 comes along. Wow, yeah. But the only point I was making is that even the framers were very concerned about the leader being a polarizing character. And the fact that they had weakened the leader so much in Venice or didn't have one at all, which is what I thought, you might have less polarization. So I was very interested in that serenity quote that I sent you and what caused the serenity.
Yeah. And they're obsessed with and that's something that's very interesting. You find it reading Machiavelli, and it turns up in the modern the founders of sort of early modern politics like Edmund Burke, Adam Smith, and that is and the founding fathers,
Yes.
which is this horror of factionalism. Now, for the founding fathers, well, the Italians know about factionalism.
Oh, yeah.
Trust me, they know about the feud, and they had the Guelphs and the Ghibellines up and down the peninsula for hundreds of years. This massive feud. So their democracies are built very specifically to try to moderate this factionalism, and the most successful
I
one was
appreciate you
Venice.
sending that.
Yeah, and then I think to some degree too, in reflecting on the American system, is the way in which, political office is a means to institutionalize the influence of some of these people in the society. So in the Venetian society, these were all aristocrats. They were essentially the leaders of society anyway. I mean, isn't that right? So I think that...
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's a big difference. Venice is an aristocracy, not a democracy. But it's 2,500 people in the Great Council.
It's kind of interesting to think about,
nobles.
And I'm not saying this is an ideal scenario, but if we had a Congress or a Senate in which we were forcing people like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates to actually sit inside these bodies, and in a way you could regulate them in a sense, and force them to not exercise unlimited influence by setting up lobby groups or managing the media in which they're...
That's fascinating. I never thought about that. That is fascinating.
It's an interesting... It's an interesting example, because what would happen is if you have Elon and Jeff and Sergey and Larry and Mark, and they're in the Great Council, they're never going to get onto the Council of 10 because the Council of the Cabinet, because to get in the Cabinet, let's say 100 electors are chosen at random. They then vote for who they think should be in the Council of 10, and nobody can get on the Council of 10 if 2/3 of the people the electors don't think that that's a good idea. And if the electors are thinking we don't want Elon's issues turning up for our city-state. He's got enough of his, he's looking after Constantinople or whatever Elon's doing. He's not going to be going very far in the public.
But he's still forced to participate in it in a way, in a kind of in a transparent way,
exactly,
rather than hiding through obvious domains.
Yeah. Well, it's not transparent. It's not transparent, but he's transparent to the people in the council. But the council puts a lot of effort into making sure that nobody hears a damn word about what was said in the council. Because it's all serenity. It's all serenity, James. That was the message. They said, look, everything's sorted. We've got it all sorted. We're very serene in that council in there.
Fascinating.
Well, I think this has been a really fascinating conversation. I look forward to playing it back and watching it again myself. I think there was a lot to learn from here. Yeah.
All right,
in 6
guys.
months'
well,
time.
I really appreciate you guys
James
meeting with me,
and
sorry for my minor lateness there. I apologize again, but that was great. You guys are both very fun people to chat with, so I hope we get to do it again.
Look, the fact that you didn't turn up on time, we were going to keep that a secret, but there you are. Accountability is its own reward, apparently.
That's the reward for anyone who's made it this far. They find that you guys were even better than you.
That's right. All right. Okay.